Hi, everybody. Welcome to the first class in the farm safety. That's what it's called, right? Webinar series. Um, so my name is Samuel DeGrey, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about biosecurity today. Um, so this class is mostly derived from one of my predecessors and one of our former colleagues in Extension and Cultivating Success, Rebecca Mills. Rebecca was the educator in Gem and Boise counties in Southwest Idaho until I believe like a month or so ago, where she moved on to greener pastures in terms of making another step in her career. Um, Anyway, she is a livestock specialist. So this presentation was originally very much geared towards livestock specifically. I'll get into introducing myself a little bit, but it is still going to mostly be about livestock, but I am going to talk just a little bit about crop biosecurity too, because biosecurity is basically for anything that you're trying to grow. It's not just a livestock thing. Um, so getting into introducing myself a little bit. So my name is Samuel DeGrey. I have been working for the University of Idaho for 4 years now, but I've only been in extension for about a year. My specialty and background is entomology, pest management. I've done a lot of research on various types of pests. In southern Idaho, I was working on a lot of potato pests. Back in Wisconsin, I worked in a lot of fruit pests. I'm also very interested in like plants, crop production, all that kind of stuff. So that's kind of my area of specialty. I'm kind of a plant and bug guy. I am not really a livestock guy. Like that's not my area of specialty. I think livestock are cool. It's just not something I know a ton about. But actually, I am very interested in like the biosecurity side of livestock. And something I'm doing here is trying to like improve our biosecurity at our 4-H weigh-ins and around the extension office in general. So I'll talk a little bit about that later. But just know that if you have any like really livestock specific questions, maybe Kate Wood here, the daughter of a one of our greatest beef ranchers, can answer those for you. Um, anyway, so moving on. Okay, why is it not changing the slide? Okay, there we go. So our learning objectives today are going to be to learn the definition of biosecurity, um, learn different ways that contamination can come into your farm or property, assess what the biggest risk factors are on your property, and then finally make an actual biosecurity plan to mitigate identified risks. I actually have a couple resources that I'll need to share in the chat. All right, so the first one is a note catcher that Rebecca designed. So this is kind of like a follow along sort of thing. It's a PDF file, so you might not be able to like edit it super easily, but there is like a little worksheet in the second page for actually putting together a biosecurity plan. So even if you're not necessarily filling it out during this class, that could be a good thing to go out and fill out after the webinar to actually have that plan and have those thoughts down on paper and have that record in place for the future. Anyway, so the next I believe I'm sending to everybody, right? Like you guys all that got that second link, right? So this is a handout from Michigan State University, and this is about the CHIP acronym for biosecurity, and we're going to go through this whole acronym, but that's cleanliness, history, isolation, and proper management practices, and it just goes into what each one of those things is. This can be a great handout once again if you have people that come by your farm or property and you want them to kind of be thinking about biosecurity because biosecurity is definitely like it takes a village kind of thing. The more people you can have thinking about it, on board with it, the better that it works. Um, and the final handout that I have, Kate, do you have, I'm not sure if this link will work for everybody, but why don't I drop it in the chat and see if you guys can open it? Yeah, I think this is actually like a download file. Um, Hold on, guys. Let me go ahead and pull this up. So also, once again, Rebecca Mills, the person who originally developed this presentation, wrote a bulletin on livestock care in general, and it has a section on biosecurity in there. I don't think that we really have any other biosecurity specific publications, but this one that I'm about to drop a link for is probably going to be the best one created by the University of Idaho. There are plenty of other great publications out there. Although, as you guys will see as we go through this talk, a lot of biosecurity stuff is kind of common sense. And it's really more about actually kind of like the hard part is often actually putting it into practice rather than the technicality of the techniques themselves. Anyway, so that should be all of the links that I have for you guys. Just in the chat, throw them in there if you guys have any problems accessing that, and feel free to email us later if there's any issues. So, are you guys seeing my slides, or are you seeing the Zoom presentation right now?
We
We
see your
see.
slides.
Awesome. Thank you. Like I said, terrible with technology. All right. So we're gonna go through three tips that Rebecca set up. And I actually ended up adding a fourth tip. It's not going to be very in depth, but the first thing we're going to get into is just a little bit of an overview on biosecurity. Um, so biosecurity is the set of steps that we take to prevent animals, and I added in here, or crops, from being infected with or spreading pathogens. So pathogens are like bacteria, fungi, viruses, anything that causes sickness or disease. It can also be insect pests too. Um, so the reason that we care about biosecurity is that we want our animals healthy and we want to protect them from harm. But it's not just about protecting us, it's also about keeping anything that's in our farm from hurting other people. Because once again, biosecurity is the kind of thing that it takes a village. The more people on board with it, the better it works. And just realistically, sometimes you are like the ground zero of something, or you're like one of the first people to get a new disease in the area. And if you are in that position, even though it can be really hard, it is good to keep in mind how you can like prevent that from leaving your farm. Um, so there's some, biosecurity, like what is a threat to your farm in terms of diseases and pathogens, et cetera, is going to be totally different for everybody. Different livestock have different sets of diseases. Certain diseases might affect like a whole group of livestock, or it could be really, really specific to one type of livestock or crop. Um, but there are kind of like some general best practices or just things to keep in mind, and we'll talk about those later. But it's probably going to look a little bit different for everybody depending on what you're growing or raising. Um, so biosecurity is one thing Rebecca has down here in her notes is that she notes that it's not something that's regulated or mandated. And at the level we're talking about it, that's true, but there are sort of like larger scale, like mandatory biosecurity kind of efforts. Like there's certain things that you have to vaccinate for, like brucellosis. There are certain diseases that are very difficult to get rid of once they're in a crop or a field, like white rot and onions. So southern Idaho, like the Snake River Plain, most of those counties are quarantined for that. So those sort of like regulatory control or like legal biosecurity efforts do exist. But for the most part, especially if you're dealing with like an emerging disease or pest, there's probably not going to be in laws in place about it because that kind of thing happens really, really slow. So you're kind of being your own advocate here for protecting your farm, working with your neighbors as much as possible. Like I said, sometimes it can be hard if you're like the first one to have something come into your system. But as much communication as you're willing to have with the people around you, with the other farmers around you, the better, because once again, it takes a village. Um, so one thing that Rebecca has here is that she asks everybody in the chat or the webinar to think about what are the best practices that you think are the best for biosecurity. So this is keeping diseases and or pests out of your farm in the first place, not treating them once they're already there, preventing them from coming in. So go ahead and throw in the chat. When you think about biosecurity, like what methods are you already using, or do you think you should be using? Because a lot of us, even the ones that are kind of educated about this, sometimes it's easy to slack on biosecurity, um, and how you can also protect others from pathogens. So go ahead and throw some of those ideas in the chat, and then Jen, you can read those out to me when people have had like a minute to think about that. All right, Jen, has anybody put anything in the chat? I can't see.
Yep, we've got one so far, hygiene factors listed.
Okay, great. Yep, hygiene's super important. There's a lot of levels to that. We'll talk a little bit about that later. Um, yeah, sanitation, being aware of who and what is coming onto your property. Those are all super important. Tip number two is what we're talking about, knowing where those risks, and in this case, a risk is a potential pathogen, pest, disease vector, etc., coming into your property. Um, so once again, this is kind of hygiene is a part of that for sure. So we're going to talk about that CHIP acronym, and once again, it's just an acronym that kind of helps you, understand this concept a little bit better. So CHIP, the C stands for cleanliness, so that's kind of like the first step. H is for history, so knowing where and when your livestock or your seed source or your soil has been and what sort of things it might have been exposed to. Not always the easiest thing to track down, depending on who you're working with, but do your best. I is for isolation. That's kind of more of a livestock thing, but you generally, when you get a new um, animal on your property, you want to keep it separate from the rest for a while so that if it's contagious for anything, it's hopefully not going to spread those to the rest of your livestock. And then the final P is for proper management practices. So actually doing the right thing for whatever disease or pests that you might have potentially coming into your property. Because that's another aspect of biosecurity is it's not just keeping things out. It's like having a plan for if you're worried about something coming into your property, having a way to deal with it in place already so that you're not just being reactive, you're being proactive. Um, and once again, just a shout out, this little CHIP acronym comes from a Michigan State 4-H program. I like to give credit where it's due. So um, first step is cleanliness. So when we're talking about livestock specifically, waste management is really important. The waste of a lot of livestock, just like most animals, does tend to have a lot of pathogens in it. So be aware of how that's interacting with the rest of your farm. Like, are there factors that are moving manure between different farms or maybe different pens in your barn or something like that? Um, what kind of what kind of ways do you interact with that waste? Like, do you just go and, wear like whatever pair of boots and gloves that you always do, and then just use that for everything without ever cleaning it or sanitizing it or anything like that? Um, those things are important to think about. Tools and equipment, really important. The most important ones probably are the ones that, like an ear tagger or something like that, anything that you're actually putting into the body of an animal itself. Those are going to be the things that you really want to focus in on for biosecurity and make sure that you have some kind of sanitation plan for that. Making sure that you're doing it regularly and at the right time, and you're not just ear tagging your animals and then moving on to the next one and not doing anything to take care of that. I always jokingly say in my like insect management classes is that specifically talking about how insects vector diseases, like you wouldn't just go off the street and pick up a needle and stick it into your skin, right? Or you wouldn't like share a needle with like five other people and then not clean it at all. You probably wouldn't do that at all. So don't do the same type of thing with your animals or crops. If there's anything with your plants where you're actually cutting through the body of the plant, like pruning or I don't know, maybe even something like mowing or something like that. If you have something that is being exposed to a lot of plant tissue, it's a good idea to sanitize that after you start to use it for like a new field or a new crop or something like that. The classic example is pruning. You always want to sanitize your pruners, even if it's something like a chainsaw or a handsaw, after ideally every cut, but that's probably unrealistic. It's probably moving from tree to tree. Same thing with animals. You probably aren't going to sanitize things every time. You might, you know, I don't know if you ever need to like ear tag things multiple times, but let's say you do. You probably don't need to sanitize between the two tags, but you definitely want to sanitize between the two different animals. Um, Once again, specifically for the livestock in general, it's really good to have kind of like a quarantine area where if you do have a sick animal, you know that you're going to be able to isolate that animal and have it not spread things to the rest of your herd. Thinking about like traffic patterns, once again, this is like where are you going? Where are the people who come in and on off of your farm going? So this is something that I think a lot about as somebody who works in extension and I visit a lot of farms. I'm really interested in starting to just like sanitize my own shoes, because like who knows what sort of diseases and things that I am tracking around from farm to farm. And a lot of times, especially the more old-fashioned types are like maybe a little bit resistant to this, but it's not a bad idea to kind of have a record, especially if you're having your like, I don't know, farmer friends over for something and you gave them a little tour of your barn or something. Just be like, oh, maybe put it in your record book. Like, hey, cousin Judy came over and she has a pig farm and she went and visited, our pig pen, and maybe just keep that in mind and just be aware that that is a potential risk for moving pathogens into your farm, right? Um, Another thing is wild animals and birds, right? Like our farms don't exist in a bubble. A lot of, the kind of like ungulates and stuff, ungulates being like hoofed animals like deer, bighorn sheep, those kind of things. They're not very distantly related from a lot of our livestock species. And a lot of times things that are closely related can pass diseases to one another. So just be aware of how those things are moving around. Birds are also a potential source. If you see a bunch of dead birds around, that's a red flag. Not even just if you're raising poultry of any kind, but I mean, some bird diseases can carry over to mammalian livestock as well. I know that avian flu, we had a horrible outbreak a couple years ago, and I actually had a friend who it transferred from wild birds, I believe, to her farm, and she went from having like a full scale farm that she was thinking of quitting her job and doing that full time, and to having nothing and having no farm because she had to cull everything that she had basically. So I'll talk about this later, but once again, biosecurity is easy to ignore until it's not. Just remember that this is important, and the like potential downsides of certain diseases coming into your farm can be like very catastrophic. Um, some other things that are good to keep in mind is that like waste management perspective, like make sure that you're like cleaning out the waste after a certain point. You don't want your animals like wallowing waist deep in their own filth. That's not a sanitary condition that it can encourage disease that can spread to the rest of your herd. Make sure that wherever you're disposing that waste is well away from water sources, or it's not in a way where it's going to leach out into where the rest of the livestock are. Um, so just keep that in mind. And once again, basically all of this stuff is just as true for crops. A lot of people don't think about it, but there are a lot of, especially like soil-borne fungal diseases that you can just pick up like on your boots and move from crop to crop, field to field, etc. So even though people don't think about it as much, still good to follow all these same practices if you're just growing crops, especially if you know that there is some kind of hard to get rid of endemic soil-borne disease out there. Like if you know that there's some onion white rot around, maybe be a little bit careful about who you're letting walk around in your onion field. Um, all right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this is something that was not in Rebecca's slides. This is all of my own like research and some of my own interests here. So once again, I've been trying to kind of improve our biosecurity at our 4-H weigh-ins, and it's a work in progress. We haven't really done anything different yet, but I'm hoping we will in the future. But I checked in with ISDA, and they recommended a couple of different products for disinfecting. So different cleaning products have different efficacies of how well that they kill different disease types or different pathogens types. Like bleach is probably the most common. But a lot of the things that you're going to be disinfecting, like an ear tagger or a pruner or whatever, oftentimes they have metal components. And I don't know exactly how it works, but bleach is very rough on metal things in general. Like I think it might encourage rust or just like cause that metal tool to sort of like break apart or degrade faster. So even though bleach is good at killing things, it's not necessarily like the best disinfectant. If there's no metal anywhere in whatever you're trying to disinfect, then maybe bleach will work. Um, but probably the most accessible disinfectant is alcohol. It's once again, it's not going to kill off everything. It's not necessarily the most effective thing, but it's definitely better than nothing. And it's the thing that you can pick up the easiest. There's two main kinds of alcohol that are available easily to, homeowners, and that is isopropyl alcohol or rubbing alcohol and ethanol, which is the same chemical as, the kind that we drink in beer and wine and whatnot. Um, you want to use quite concentrated alcohol, really as concentrated as you can get, the better. 70% is generally the minimum. I know that, like I said, I'm an entomologist to do a lot of insect work. I know that that is the absolute bare minimum to not have like microbial activity in like preserved insect specimens. Generally higher than that, like up to 99% is probably going to be better. Once again, alcohol isn't even necessarily like the absolute best thing for killing off like every single kind of pathogen that you might encounter. But so ISDA recommends for best practices. So if you're really trying to dial in your sanitization, this is what you should probably get a hold of. But chlorhexidine is a broad spectrum like antimicrobial chemical that's used by a lot of vets. I think it's even used in human medicine to some extent, but don't quote me on that. I don't know anything about that. I'm not a doctor, not a vet either. Um, but it works really well, and this is what she recommended that we like clean our ear taggers with, and stuff like that. It's pretty inexpensive. You can get a bottle online for I think like $14 or something like that, for I think like a couple liters. So, maybe not quite as cheap as rubbing alcohol, but not necessarily gonna break the bank. The downside of chlorhexidine is that it doesn't work on viruses. Viruses are really weird, and I'm not gonna get into their biology, or I guess it's technically not biology because they're not alive or whatever. Um, but a lot of things like alcohol and chlorhexidine generally don't actually affect viruses at all because of like really weird way that they are structured. So this product, Beercon, will actually kill off at least some viral diseases to some extent. So it is theoretically the best disinfectant for your livestock operation. The downside of BeerCon is that it is a little bit on the spendier side. It's definitely more expensive than chlorhexidine. It's definitely way more expensive than rubbing alcohol. But it's not like crazy expensive. I can't remember. I think it's like $40 for a couple liters. Don't quote me on that. But anyway, just know that these products exist, and these top two ones are the recommended ones by ISDA. Another thing to keep in mind is that if you're disinfecting anything that has manure, you're going to want to clean that manure off before you disinfect the surface below, because if there's like pathogens inside the manure, these are only going to kill whatever's on the outside, right? They're not going to kill those pathogens that are on the inside. So if you spray any of these disinfectants, it doesn't matter what it is, just like straight onto a surface that's just covered with manure, that's not going to be doing anything. So just keep that in mind. All right.
Daniel,
Yes.
before we move on, there is a question in the chat that asks, are there pathogen considerations to fertilizer usage?
Yeah, it depends on what fertilizer that you're using. If once again, knowing where that fertilizer is coming from, if it's coming from somewhere, like if you're getting like compost or manure from a farm where maybe there's some diseases or something like that, or maybe even that farm is just growing or raising the same things that you are, then I would consider there to be a pathogen risk. And I think that how you manage that risk depends on what it is that you're growing or raising, maybe what you know about the disease history of that farm or area. One thing to keep in mind when you're getting into like the history of this CHIP acronym is that a lot of people don't actually know that they have a disease or pathogen on their property, especially because I don't know, sometimes diseases and pathogens, the effects that they cause are not always like clearly caused by a disease. Like especially in plants, a lot of times people will be like, "Oh, this thing's yellowing up. It must be just like nutrient deficient or something like that." Um, but anyway, basically my answer is potentially yes. I mean, anything can be a pathogen concern if it's coming from an area that has contamination. So it depends on what kind of fertilizer you're using and where it's coming from.
Thanks.
Of course. Any other questions?
No, not at this time.
Okie dokie. I'm gonna go ahead and move on. All right, so that's a perfect segue into the history section of the CHIP acronym. And the first thing is once again knowing where your animals came from. does that farm keep vaccination records? Does that farm have any history with diseases that they'll tell you about? Because once again, they might not know. If they do know, they might not want to tell you. It's a pretty common thing, and it's understandable to some extent. Probably not if you know that your animals are sick and you're not telling people, maybe something that you could relate to, but not the right thing to do. And if your animals are sick, you should let other people who are farming the same kind of animals in your area and moving onto your property or trying to buy from you know about that. That's the ethical thing to do. But once again, people don't always do the right thing. Just knowing what diseases impact your species, and that's really like knowing the life cycle of that disease, how it spreads, which species are the most susceptible. The same disease can cause different symptoms in different species, and that goes for both plants and animals. Um, Knowing like for animals, what the vaccination protocols are, what vaccinations are actually required, what vaccinations might be like best practice, and once again, if whoever you're buying your animal from, because once again, you're not always buying it from like, you might be getting it from like your Aunt Judy or whatever, who might not necessarily like follow all the best practices for livestock record keeping. Just get as much information about that health history as you possibly can. And Rebecca here has records, 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 and I couldn't agree more. If you don't have a record book for your livestock and your farm, you absolutely should. It goes just as equally for crops and livestock. Just keep track of everything, but especially things that relate to health and diseases. If your animals get sick, keep track of when you first saw the symptoms, keep track of what species it was, how those symptoms progressed, etc. Because that's going to be really valuable for the future and potentially, maybe mitigating them getting that disease again, or maybe even helping diagnose what that disease is, because, like maybe those symptoms will subside when you take them to the vet, and that information could help them narrow down that diagnosis quite a bit. Um, let's see. Um, well, it's not necessarily on here, but one thing that I do just want to point out is that once again, relatedness is really important in terms of like how easily things are able to transfer from one another. Like the more close related two animals or plants are to each other, the more likely they are to share diseases or pests, right? That's a pretty basic, like biological and agricultural concept in general. I've only ever heard of one plant disease that could transfer from plants to animals or humans anyway, and like infect both. And that was like a weird freak occurrence for sure. But just keep in mind that if you're raising livestock, there are a lot of diseases that human beings can catch as well, or even potentially like give to the livestock. So the biosecurity is also about your interactions with the animals too, and how you can keep your safe and the animals safe as well. So once again, that just goes into knowing what diseases impact your species, knowing if they can jump over to you, or like, if you have a disease, if it's possible for you to give it to your livestock. Super important thing to have in mind. But once again, just keep records. It's the easiest and hardest thing to do in the world, right? Because it's so easy to slack on. I am so much worse about keeping records than I should be. But when that moment comes that you have a disease coming into your farm, it can make a world of difference in terms of helping you accurately diagnose and manage that disease. Um, so moving into the isolation part of the CHIP acronym. So a general guideline that I've heard many times, at least for cattle, and I think this goes for all livestock, is that you want to separate new animals for at least 14, ideally up to 30 days or like a month. And what that's going to do is allow you to monitor for signs of illness because, you know this probably kind of intuitively from being an animal that gets sick sometimes is that when you're infected with the disease, the symptoms don't always present immediately. It might have a couple of weeks incubation period. You might have really, really minor symptoms that are easy to overlook at first that could very rapidly become worse. So that's part of it is just keeping those things, or even like an animal could be asymptomatic and not show any symptoms at all and still be able to spread disease from one thing to another. Um, in plants, there are some plants and insects that can vector diseases or be like a host for that disease and not actually present any symptoms. So that's another thing to keep in mind. It's a little bit different from isolating animals, but a kind of similar concept. So when you're in the isolation period, and once again, you should have somewhere on your farm, like if you're kind of a new farmer, maybe keep in mind where that like quarantine pen is going to be. Um, but you're gonna have them in that isolated spot where you're gonna monitor them for signs of illness. Once again, look into the history of that species. Maybe talk to your local vet and ask them what they would be most concerned in terms of like what diseases might be in your area, and ask them what those symptoms would present as. If they are sick, treat it. Once again, make sure that you're you're following the correct time between treatment and how long you'd expect for them to recover and not be contagious before you introduce them back into the main area where the rest of your livestock are. Um, Another thing to think about in terms of isolation is that it's not for the animals themselves. It's also for the things that interact with those animals. And once again, I've kind of talked about this before, but you don't want to be wearing clothes that are moving a lot, either between like maybe you have that little quarantine pen where you're putting your new or sick animals into, or other people's farms. You know, you don't want to be wearing those same pair of boots and moving back and forth between the two because it's like, you know, that's going to be spreading pathogens around. A lot of times pathogens can survive in soil, they can survive on various surface of things, so maybe if you have a quarantine pen, have like a set of clothes that's just for that pen. If you're going onto other people's farms, maybe don't wear those same clothes when you're in your farm area. It's so easy and so hard to do because it's so easy to overlook the risk of these pathogens because we can't see them. It's not a problem until it is, but it's great practice. Like I said, I need to be better about this myself. You can even do things like they sell like little plastic booties. Maybe you could even just like, I don't know, there's got to be some way to DIY that. But if you really want to be serious about preventing disease spreading, it's not a bad idea to wear some like protection on your shoes when you're moving onto someone else's farm. Or if you're somebody who does like farm tours, if you work with us in Extension, it's not a bad idea to have some way to like mitigate what people might potentially be tracking in. Same thing for tools and equipment. Maybe don't loan out your tools to just everybody, like your Aunt Judy that has a separate farm, especially if that separate farm is like in another state that might have a wildly different set of pathogen stars, and then maybe you're bringing those pathogens back. I don't know why you'd be like lending your tools to someone who lives like super far away, but I'm sure that scenario probably exists somewhere. Um, And Rebecca just has a note here that is just take a second to think, where have your boots been today? Super important thing. Keep a record of it, keep a record of where you've been walking around, and don't track it into your farm. So, moving into the last letter of the acronym, which is implementing proper management practices. The first one, always, and once again, this goes equally for animals and plants, keep the healthy animals and plants healthy. A healthy animal is going to be better able to handle an infection from a disease. It's probably going to be less likely to become infected in the first place. Same thing goes for plants. A lot of times, even in like insect pest management, if a plant is healthy from the beginning, like it's being watered, fertilized, getting the right amount of light, etc., it's going to be more resistant to even an insect pest that's feeding on it than if it was stressed out in the first place. Um, Once again, keep vaccination protocols. Make sure that you're vaccinating for the right diseases that you need to for your livestock species in your area. Keep track of who and what are coming on in and off of your farm. Once again, especially if there are farmers near you that you visit a lot with, even if it's just your buddy down the street that are raising the same kinds of animals or crops as you, those are probably going to be your most likely source of contamination. But I mean, it can basically be anywhere. Another thing that Rebecca really likes to emphasize and when she talks about this series is just monitoring. Just like look at your animals, be aware of like what's normal for them because it's different in different breeds, right? Like what's normal in one breed or species might be totally like not normal in another one. So to really like be able to tell when something's off with your animals, you kind of have to have that baseline, right? So just, go out every day, see how your animals are doing, see how they're behaving. And maybe make a record if you see some kind of like off behavior. And keep track of that. And if off behavior ends up resulting in disease, keep track of that too, because that can maybe help you identify that disease in the future, if it happens again. Um, so some of this stuff in terms of management practices are also discussed in that bulletin article that Rebecca wrote a while ago. So that's linked in the chat. And if you're raising livestock, I would read through that. It's a great resource. She goes through like a 5-step process for like just starting out raising livestock and keeping track of your animal health and all of those other good things. All right. So before we get to tip number 3, um, if you guys could just take a few minutes, go ahead and write down what you think that your primary risks are in terms of diseases and pathogens coming into your property, whether it's maybe you're not sanitizing things as well as you should be, maybe you're not really keeping track of who's coming in and out of your property. Maybe your record keeping could have been a little bit better. Maybe your sources aren't the like sources where you get your animals and other things are not as like open as you think that they should be. Did anyone write down what they thought that some of their biggest risks might be?
We did have one comment in the chat talking about history and pruning or cutting tools as it relates to a small scale or hobby plant farm.
Awesome. Yeah. And that's great. Once again, this is just important for plants as it is for livestock. And for some reason I find, I don't know if you would agree with this, Jen, but I feel like maybe it goes under the radar a little bit more for plants than livestock. Um, and so anyway, that's something that I always like to emphasize. Anyway, so we're gonna go ahead and move on. So the final tip is to make a plan. So this is in one of those other handouts that I put in the chat there earlier. But these are just a few questions that you can go and ask yourself. I've already kind of, hopefully started you thinking about this a little bit. But maybe one thing, once you've identified your risks, like, so maybe in this case, the risk is potentially transferring diseases from tree to tree. So it's like, what are 3 things that you could mitigate the risks for that? One could be just like knowing what diseases affect that tree species and what they present as, so that if you do have the disease come in, then you know like where it is and what it is, and you can like make sure that you're really sanitizing if you're ever like pruning around that or anything. It could be getting the right kind of disinfectant that will actually kill that disease, because once again, not every disinfectant product is going to be able to sanitize every single kind of pathogen, especially if you're dealing with a viral pathogen. And one thing I forgot to note, but a lot of times you'll need slightly different products to like disinfect for things like nematodes or roundworms or those other like pests that are actually animals but kind of behave like diseases. So those are all things to keep in mind. Another thing could be, um, well, that's all I have for the fruit tree example, I guess. Anyway, moving on, what research do you already have that will help you carry out your plan? So you've identified what you need to do. Now just think about like what sort of things you have access to that could help you do that. One of those resources could be extension, like you're already plugged into this. You could reach out, and maybe ask advice for what diseases you're most concerned about. Your local vet is another resource for that potentially. ISDA is a potential resource for that. They have a lot of good pathologists and veterinary people that work for them. And then finally, just ask yourself, what resources do you need but don't already have to implement all of those biosecurity management strategies that you've already thought about? So this is also in that handout, but here's just a little chart that you can use to fill out um, in terms of what, different things you're actually going to put into place. And personally, I would add like a 4th column here that has like price on it, or maybe even like a little bit of a cost benefit analysis type thing. Once again, honestly, a lot of biosecurity stuff isn't necessarily that expensive, but there is still a spectrum. Like I talked about how BeerCon, is going to be the best but most expensive versus like isopropyl alcohol is going to be the worst but least expensive disinfectant. So just keep that kind of stuff in mind. Let's see if she has something else. So this is just an example of that, like, stuff that you might need would be like a disinfectant, a pair of like barn-specific boots that you only wear in places where there could be a potential for picking up a pathogen, and you're not wearing those boots to other people's farms. You're not wearing them inside the house. You're not wearing them to the hardware store, etc. Buying a record book, that's something you could probably just throw together, from stuff you get from the dollar store. And I think there's actual ones that you can buy. They're like official record books as well. It really depends on what you need, and it's kind of that cost benefit thing, etc. So this is once again all in that handout. All of those resources are also on the Cultivating Success website somewhere. I don't believe it. I don't know if Kate, you have that link around. I believe I have it. I can drop in the chat later. Um, so finally, I threw another fourth tip in here, and I've already kind of talked about it, but really like most of these biosecurity things we've talked about, they're kind of like common sense, right? Some of you guys might be thinking like, all right, like I already know that it's important to sanitize things. It's important to keep in mind about how I might be transferring diseases around. But the important thing about biosecurity really is actually doing it and really just treating that risk with the respect that it deserves. Because once again, like I already shared that anecdote of my friend, like a real story in Southern Idaho that went from having like a pretty solid farm operation with like 4 or 5 different species of livestock and to having nothing within a year because she had a disease come in and wipe everything out or she had to cull things. Um, and keep in mind, like certain diseases, like I believe avian flu is one of them, you are legally required to actually like get rid of your livestock if you're infected with them. So keep that in mind in your risk assessment too, because those diseases you really, really don't want to have for coming to your farm. And it's just the whole thing is just an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Goes for a lot of things in life. Another plug that I'm gonna throw in here, and I'll drop this link in the chat real fast. Um, so we have a system in the University of Idaho to alert people when new pests or diseases are coming into a new area. It's basically a mailing list, and you can get texts, you can get emails. But you guys should all sign up for this if you haven't already. This is a great way to stay up to date on like new potential threats that are coming into an area. So this is information that might not necessarily be like Googleable, like if the University of Idaho knows that a new pest is coming to an area, that might not be something that like you and your neighbors could be aware of. So this is once again kind of more on the crop production side of biosecurity of preventing diseases and pests from moving into an area. But I mean, I am at least very interested and open to using this for livestock diseases as well, especially new ones that are coming into an area. So even if you're primarily a livestock farmer, could be a valuable thing to sign up for if you're in North Idaho and I'm the one who's posting pest alerts. All right, so that's all I've got for you. I'll take any questions, and I just want to give a shout out to Rebecca Mills, who is the one who originally put together this presentation, and she is a for real livestock expert. These are all her animals up here on the top. She also now has a small business that does small farm consulting and custom writing. I don't know a ton about that, but if you're in the like Southwest Idaho area and you're in the market for that kind of stuff, maybe shoot her an email there. I dropped that email in this final slide. But that is all I got. We finished up about 10 minutes early, so I'll go ahead and take any questions if anybody has any.
I don't see any questions yet. But I have just maybe one question. What do you think about some of the agritourism enterprises for small farms, and how might they best manage biosecurity with those?
I think that, and this is something that I am interested in doing in our own sort of like agritourism type stuff when we schedule farm tours, but I think that boot wash stations are a great place to start. Um, I think that chlorhexidine would probably be a pretty good compound to put in those boot wash stations. But what those are is that for livestock disease specifically, what those are is you'll just have like a little tub and you'll have everybody go through and like scrub their boots off both before and after the tour. If you are worried about like a crop that's susceptible, those booties are great. We had to use them when working in seed potato fields in southern Idaho, and they would make people use those whenever they had a tour scheduled. It might be a little bit excessive if it's for a crop that maybe isn't like super susceptible to some kind of soil-borne disease. But I also think that it's also good just to have a little talk about biosecurity at the beginning of some of those farm tours. That's something that I would like to start doing myself because once again, just having people thinking about it and getting people on board with not necessarily wearing the same clothing or shoes that they're wearing to their own farms when they go on those tours, because a lot of times it is other farmers that like to attend those kinds of things, right? Can be a great place to start.
Great, thanks. We did just have a comment in the chat, just said thank you, and that this was informative for new plant farmer.
That's awesome. Thanks, Melissa. And I hope that you hopefully in your new plant farming endeavors, you keep some of these biosecurity things in mind and maybe even prevent a future tragedy at some point. Well, thank you both for coming, Melissa and Nelly.